We are honored to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs here in Jerusalem as a guest of the newly created program on economics and society at the Van Leer Institute. The program's stated objective is, and since it is the first public lecture that we have, I will quote it, to participate in and influence debates on social and economic policy with a focus on such pressing questions as inequality, the labor market, social welfare, health and education, and macroeconomics policies. The idea is to examine alternatives to current economic policies, which will be based on achieving sustainable economic growth in ways that will promote the well-being of all citizens and greater equality within society. There is probably not a better qualified person than Professor Sachs to be our first guest speaker, and I really thank him for coming. Those who know Professor Sachs' record will remember that after a very quick start at Harvard University, where he became a full professor under the age of 30, he was involved in all the major debates concerning economics and social policy over the last 20 years. His encounters with Israel and Israelis more than 25 years ago brought us an analysis of stagflation in the mid-80s, written with our late colleague, Professor Bruno. He was then involved in the debt crisis in the Third World, where he contributed heavily to the Bolivian stabilization program and the first debt reduction plan. Professor Sachs was then involved with the Polish reform of the 80s and then with the Russian transformation in the early 90s, on which I will not say anything. But in recent years, he became the advocate, the capital letter, of global poverty reduction, the subject of his most recent book and many of efforts. Just to quote from the list of speeches and presentations during 1 month in 2005, he spoke about poverty reduction in the Islamic world, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, on March, getting serious about development assistance at the Center for Global Development in Washington, and the business community and the Millennium Development Goals, International Policy Forum in Berlin, all in February, March. Thus, Professor Sachs addresses the downside of economics and social reality on Earth. Extreme poverty, on which we'll probably hear more, is widespread. We face more poverty in Israel than many people had expected, though extreme poverty is probably known more in the Gaza Strip than in Israel proper. Both moderate poverty in Israel and extreme poverty in Gaza should be addressed. Professor Sachs is the director of the Earth Institute in Columbia University. His thinking on the global arena is of great interest to every human being. I'm sure that his ideas will help us in thinking on how to address the pressing economic and social issues in Israel and fill the gaps in what the public as well as the policymakers in Israel think about poverty, about the market, known sometimes as the invisible hand, and the necessary visible hand, whether these interventions are the global or the local arenas. One of the lessons learned over the years concerns the importance of shaping policies locally so that they can address the specific situations in different countries rather than implement usually pro-market advice from outside. In our newly created program, we'll try to follow that recommended method. I would like to ask Dr. Czerniker, the head of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, to
not address you. I just will say a couple of words of welcome. It's a miracle that we have, as nice an audience as this is, because people actually braved the lunacy that runs our public highways nowadays, and I welcome all of you. I will say after this very nice and comprehensive introduction of Professor Sachs that I have one thing to recommend him, and it is based on an hour-long meeting with him. In extreme crises, one of the difficulties that a person finds themselves in is being unable, given the acute crisis he is in, to know whether he is normal, whether the world is normal, or whether the relationship between him and the world are normal. Listening to him, I found my bearings again, and I know that however suspicious I am of economics, it is not because of the nature of the theory or the field, but because of the practitioners. And he brought back a little measure of belief to a skeptic. I was raised by a Lithuanian mother who didn't believe in invisible anything, least of all hands. So I could never really be an economist. I welcome him. I heard wonderful words of wisdom from him before, and I wish you the same joy and pleasure that I did. Professor Jeffrey
Thank you so much. It's really so wonderful to be here, and so wonderful of you to come. I was going to thank all of you for coming here despite the odds of travel today, but then I realized that maybe all of you are here because you're trapped. You meant to be in Tel Aviv tonight, but couldn't get there, and this is the second best you can do. And so if that's the case, I hope it's an okay consolation. I have cousins from around that are not here tonight because they didn't want to brave the road, so which is too bad for me because it's so great to be back in Israel today, and unfortunately I can't see some of my family because of the mishap. But it is a strange and wonderful thing that I'm here. I'm on a kind of unusual travel schedule these days. I got a call from my wonderful friend and colleague Yossi Zeir of Hebrew University, who called a couple of weeks ago and said, I know this is probably impossible. I know your crazy travel schedule, that there's probably no way you can take this up, but Van Leer Institute has invited you. And I'm just asking and conveying, I know, that it's probably impossible, but is there any way in late June that you could come to Israel? And I said, and I looked, and it turned out, I said, yeah, actually, that's just the day in between the travel from Tajikistan to Yemen, which it actually is. And so yesterday I was in Tajikistan, and tomorrow I'm on my way to Yemen. And my main discovery as advisor to Kofi Annan is just how many countries there really are in the United Nations, and how, as an advisor, I have to visit each of them. And it's very interesting to do so, I must say. But it turned out this was perfect from a travel point of view also, except for the highways, but going by air was all right. I didn't have to drive from Tajikistan or drive to Yemen, so it should be okay. Well, thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to try to be on the brief side of my formal remarks because I found the discussion we just had for an hour so fascinating that I want to leave enough time for discussion in our group this evening with questions, answers, and comments, and hope that we can discuss every subject of even some tangential relevance to what I'm going to talk about right now. But we talked a lot about the politics of wealth and poverty within the last hour, and other issues of concern both to the U.S. and Israel, and we can certainly touch on that. But I'm going to talk about issues that are not so immediately pertinent to Israel, though I think Israel should be playing more of a role in them than it does. And there are issues, definitely, as you said, even in Gaza and so forth, for which the remarks that I'm going to make this evening are directly relevant. I've been concerned with the issues of globalization for more than 2 decades as a I hope practical, but at least as a policy advisor. I would say as a practical policy advisor trying to solve problems. And during that time, I have been, in general, a believer in markets and a believer in globalization, but also a believer in the limits of what markets can do and in the limits of what globalization can do. And this middle position of being in favor of markets but not, I believe, in the fantasy of the complete power of markets to solve problems, leaves one in between those who, say on the globalization debate, believe that globalization is the greatest thing ever. Tom Friedman believes the world is flat. If you've carried his book, The World Actually Is Not Flat. The title is wrong and the concept is wrong, as I'll describe, but it's kind of the boosterism that we're all running this great race right now and it's all fine and good and everybody can be part of the wonders of modern life. And on the other hand, those who say, well, obviously that's not right, and then go on to say that globalization is a terrible thing, and there's a whole anti-globalization movement that argues that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer because the rich exploit the poor and are widening the gaps, and that this is headlong to disaster. And for 20 years in my work in mainly poor countries, and increasingly over time in poorer and poorer countries, I found that both sides of this debate are quite naive. On the one hand, I do believe markets play an important role and that globalization has some important positive effects. But on the other hand, I have discovered early on in my own experience that there are real limits to what markets and globalization do achieve, and that if we don't have a very sound and concerted collective policy through government in areas addressing critical needs of society, whether it's health or education or basic infrastructure, access to basic needs like safe drinking water, which is a concern for Gaza, for example. Markets alone are not going to solve these problems, and globalization certainly won't. Over time, I became more and more alarmed at the lack of global public awareness of the situation of the poorest of the poor on the planet. Because if you think about the invisibility of the poor, say, in Israeli society, and it's certainly true in American society right now, where the poor don't exist because there's no mention of them and there's no reporting, the situation of the poorest of the poor on the planet is even more dramatically the case. There are more than 1 billion people who do not come close to having their basic needs met on a daily basis, people that are struggling for survival, nothing less than that, thousands who lose the struggle every day. And what I have come to believe is two things. One, there's no way in the world that markets are going to save these people, because frankly markets are designed to ignore these people, not to save them. If a businessman says, I'm going to go invest in rural Ethiopia, I'm going to sell my shares, if I had any, because that's the last thing that a business ought to do right now. It's not a business that's going to save the poorest of the poor in Ethiopia. It's going to be us through collective action of one way or another. But the second thing that I've come to believe is that these are solvable problems of this 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. And actually, the more one deals directly with them, and it's been my good fortune to have 20 years of on-the-ground experience and 10 years very intensively in Africa since the mid-1990s, the problems, the more you look at them, are less the grand ideological problems and more very specific problems like, how do I get bed nets to this village so that the children don't die of malaria? And the more you see the problems in very practical terms, the more you realize how solvable they are. And the corollary to that for me is that these are not local problems, because I don't believe there is such thing as local anymore in the world economy in terms of politics and interest. That if we just leave the poor to their own devices right now, not only is there human tragedy that I would say is ethically unjustified and intolerable, but also there's practical hell to pay for it in the spread of disease, in mass migration, in violence, in terror, in other things, and that the idea that you can leave a whole continent of 750 million impoverished Africans to their own device Because as someone wrote to me in an email yesterday from America, why should I care about Africa? I have my own problems. That kind of view is really a very serious misunderstanding of the nature of our world right now. Because even if markets don't reach these people reach us, and their problems reach us in myriad ways. And it's just foolhardy to think that we can live behind gates. Well, you're trying to live behind a wall, and we're trying to live behind a missile shield. And I don't believe that Maginot Lines work in my own view of the world. I think the world is much too small and interconnected to believe that these static defense lines actually protect us from anything. I believe that we have to learn to live with each other, and that if we don't, we're all going to suffer, and that there is no such thing as a gated community for protection. So I was lucky to be asked 5 years ago to help address these issues at an international scale in some sense. First as a head of a commission for the World Health Organization, which looked at the problems particularly of the mass death and suffering of the poorest of the poor on the planet. We're living at a time where the rich, and thank God, Israeli society as well as the United States has a life expectancy of 80, while the poorest of the poor have a life expectancy of 40. And that, by the way, says there's a lot more behind that, because the 40 years that the poor live are not healthy 40 years. They're disease-burdened 40 years, they're disability-laden 40 years, they're crisis-laden 40 years. And the increasing lifespan of, in the richest parts of the world, are increasingly healthy lifespans as well. So there's a lot behind even those simple statistics. That commission for WHO was called the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, and we issued a report in 2001 which said that it would be possible for the rich to help the poor to avert 8 million deaths every year. You'd think that would actually start to count for something, and I believe that it does count for something. We laid out a kind of roadmap of how public health could be extended to parts of the world that don't have public health systems right now, because that, in essence, is a major starting point for understanding this gap. There just are large parts of the world where poor people don't have access to preventative or therapeutic health care of almost any kind at all. After that report was issued and helped to generate at least one institutional innovation, which is called the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, Kofi Annan asked me to advise him on a broad set of poverty reduction initiatives called the Millennium Development Goals. And those are goals that were enunciated adopted by the world community, at least by the political leadership of the world, in September 2000 at what was called then the Millennium Summit at the United Nations, where world leaders got together and said that we have a good chance with our science, technology, and wealth to extend the benefits of prosperity more widely, and that this would indeed be both important and conducive to global security, and that therefore would be worthwhile to set some goals for reducing extreme poverty, hunger, and disease. And these were codified in a set of 8 goals called the Millennium Development Goals, which set quantitative targets, in fact, for attacking poverty in these dimensions by the year 2015. And they are about as specific as goals can get, calling for income poverty, measured usually as living under $1 per day, to be cut by half comparing the 1990 baseline with 2015. Child mortality, which is the number of children that die before their 5th birthday for every 1,000 that are born, to be cut by 2/3 as of 2015 compared to 1990. Maternal mortality, which is obviously the number of deaths of mothers in childbirth and perinatal conditions, to be cut by 3/4 between 1990 and 2015. The proportion of people living in hunger, which is typically not famine hunger but chronic undernutrition of various sorts, both macro and micro undernutrition, to be cut by half by 2015. And the proportion of people without access to safe drinking water and sanitation to be cut by half by 2015 compared to 1990. So those are the Millennium Development Goals. And the Secretary General asked me to mobilize a global network of practitioner scientists from various fields: economics, agronomy, public health, environmental engineering, sanitation, and so forth, to address the possibility of meeting these goals in each country. And it happens, happily, for my ability to be here today, that Tajikistan and Yemen are two countries that are among a small group of focal point countries for our project. We issued a report in January of this year that said that these goals can indeed be met, but won't be met. And this comes back to my opening remarks. What we said was that both sides of this great ideological argument between globalization and anti-globalization are mistaken in their understanding of the world situation. On the one hand, a lot of economic development is in fact taking place, and a lot of poverty reduction in fact is taking place in the world. So don't completely despair. Basically, Asia is in the midst of a positive economic revolution, which is heavily, quite fundamentally situated in globalization itself. The rise of the Chinese economy and the Indian economy and Southeast Asian economy is a globalization phenomenon. It's not internal, it's actually an internationally based phenomenon. It's China's ability to export to world markets and India's ability to export to world markets, which is quite a fundamental part of the reduction of the numbers living in extreme poverty by hundreds of millions, in fact, during the past 15 years. But we said, on the other hand, don't be ridiculous to think that these trends are somehow going to solve the problems for all the world's poor. A rising tide, as the old cliche goes, does not actually lift all boats, especially given the fact that very poor people don't have boats. And a lot of them, in particular, as I'll stress, live in places that have no tide also. Not accidentally, they often live in landlocked parts of the world that are quite far from international trade. And so we noted that there are 50 or more countries in the world that are wildly off track to meet these Millennium Development Goals. Now, the idea of setting the goals in the first place was that a partnership of rich and poor countries could help the poor to meet the goals. And the rich countries reaffirm their commitment to do that. President Clinton, on behalf of the United States, signed, and then interestingly, about a year and a half after the first declaration was made, there was a meeting in Monterrey, Mexico, where even, I'll say, George Bush signed a commitment to participate in this way. One major thing intervened, although many things could be said about the period between the declaration of these goals and where we are today. And the main thing that intervened in American politics was September 11th. And to the extent that there was any interest at all in these goals in the American public, it basically disappeared after September 11 because we launched two wars This has been 100% dominating American foreign policy since that moment. And the only issue that competes with the war on terror, so-called in American political space, is the tax cuts of the super rich in America, which is the other motivating factor of the Bush administration. So this issue has not played much of a role in America, and when things are ignored by America, they tend actually to be ignored by a lot of the world, because America has at least the loudest claim on public debate in the world. And the issues that have been debated are always the American agenda issues, it seems, not necessarily the needs of the rest of the world. The result is that since 9/11 claimed 3,000 lives, by my estimate, 20,000 people have died every single day of extreme poverty. And all of that is all the more painful, those 8 million deaths every year, because of the fact that we could so readily do something about it. So that's all preamble to what I wanted to actually show you, and I've already lied about speaking briefly, but I want to quickly show you why we could do something about it, and then I promise I will stop and open for discussion. For me, the most important thing in everything that I've learned is that I could never imagine anything without actually being there. And the result of this is I've come to, I actually like economics. I've now been kind of in this field for 33 years, and I find it a rather compellingly interesting subject matter, and so I love it as much today as I did from the first day. But I've also, and I actually like economic theory a lot, but I've come to believe that I and I think most of my colleagues, except for a couple true geniuses, can't figure out anything without actually seeing things. And so what I've learned in my life is that I better see things, because I've never understood it until I've actually seen it, even more than seeing it, until I've been involved in problem solving. And so I believe more and more that economics should be like what is for me the paradigm of science-based problem solving, and that's clinical medicine. And my clinical medicine wife, teacher of mine, is somewhere. Sonia? There you are. I have learned good differential diagnosis from Sonia, how to diagnose a problem, how to understand that symptoms are not the same thing as underlying etiology, how to understand how to do a systematic analysis of underlying possible etiologies, and then make prescriptions that are science-based. Unfortunately, economics is nothing like that in how it's actually practiced. Sonia's textbooks of pathology are generally about 1,200 to 2,000 pages. They have 35 chapters for each major human system. Each of those has its own textbook and so forth. In the economics development textbook, it's just one page of pathology. Now, today's textbook of economic pathology just has the word corruption on it. This is the only thing that's believed about the poor, is that they live in corrupt places, and if they would just be like us, then they would solve their problems. Unfortunately, being like us in the case of the United States might lead to more corruption rather than less corruption, because there's no greater master of corruption than what I see right now in Washington and elsewhere. But I think it's a completely flawed idea to have a one-page textbook. Other people have a one-page book. They call it institutions. This is, in general, in my mind, also a almost completely unhelpful category. At least pre-modern medicine had 4 bodily humors. There were 4 of them. Economists tend to focus on one. Maybe it's markets or institutions or corruption, but actually good diagnosis would lead to the recognition that the poorest of the poor are poor because they face a variety of challenges which need to be understood. And that's what seeing can help. So let me introduce you to the people that I meet, and Sonia, who works with me on the public health aspects of this, meets when we travel to and work in the poorest of the poor parts of the world. Let me finally say parenthetically that the epicenter of this challenge is in Africa, although there are large numbers of extreme poor in South Asia, some still in East Asia, the Andean region, and Central Asia. That's where most of the world's extreme poor live. What makes Africa the epicenter of extreme poverty is that the degree of poverty is the greatest, and the numbers are rising, whereas in other parts of the world, the severity of the poverty is somewhat less. For instance, child mortality rates are almost inevitably by far the highest in Africa, as well as life expectancy the lowest, but also the numbers are tending to fall, if sometimes too gradually in other places in the world, while they're rising in Africa. So I'm going to focus a lot on the African situation right now. This is a household in Malawi. We visited in March 2002, and it is paradigmatic of the crisis of extreme poverty. First, this is a grandmother and her grandchildren. She is a grandmother who is now raising 15 orphaned grandchildren because she has lost all her children to the AIDS pandemic. This is something that is seen throughout Africa, especially southern and eastern Africa, an utter disaster of pandemic disease sweeping through rural areas in particular. We came to Malawi in the middle of a food crisis, an acute famine, and there is one again in 2005. The intervening years were a bit better, but right now there's another extreme food crisis. Why? Well, Malawi is in a part of the savanna climate system. This is the two-season wet, dry climate, and it's, as in most of Africa, the wet season is highly variable and perhaps increasingly irregular, as well as with diminishing rainfall. There's always a lot of speculation about long-term climate fluctuations, whether they reflect global climate change or whether they're just decadal excursions or whatever, and no one can be sure, but places like Malawi have had declining rainfall and quite variable rainfall, and this was a year of drought in 2002, as is the current year. So when we arrived in this village, we drove past miles of failed crops, basically maize, which was dead on the vine. It's important to understand that 96% of Africa's food production is rain-fed. There's almost no irrigation in Africa. This is it's mostly topographical and hydrological. Africa does not have the great river systems of Asia, which lead to the vast irrigation-based civilizations of the Yangtze or the Mekong or the Ganges or the Brahmaputra or the Indus River Valley. Africa is mainly rain-fed, and most of Africa is living in this savanna, wet, dry climate with high vulnerability to drought. And those who live in the equatorial humid region face profound challenges of inadequate soils, basically, that compound many other problems. When we got to Malawi, of course, what we saw were communities that were in extreme hunger, miserably nourished children that were chronically undernourished to the extent of extreme stunting. So all of these children are 2 or 3 or 4 years older than they look. All of them are one z-score or more below the mean for their age. It's not atypical that 40 or 50% of the children are qualified as stunting or wasted in a population like this. And this was the situation here. They had almost nothing to eat. In addition to AIDS, which had destroyed the working age population, and the drought, this region is filled with other pandemic diseases. All of these children carry year-round geohelminthic infection, so worm infestation is absolutely rampant, and they're all vulnerable and vulnerable to malaria. This is a holoendemic malaria environment, meaning year-round, high-level malaria transmission, to the extent that every one of these children basically will be infected year-round by the protozoan, and with clinical episodes that might be 5 to 10 clinical episodes a year, any one of which can kill the child, and any one of which can leave a lifetime disability from stroke, cerebral hemorrhage from cerebral malaria, or other kinds of disabilities, anemia, and so forth, that can be completely debilitating. What do you see in a village like this besides the tragedy? I see three underlying very deep factors. One is isolation. This is a landlocked country. There are no paved roads in these villages to begin with. Getting to a port is a profound ordeal, not least of which is you cross a political boundary, which is a hell anywhere on the planet almost. But in Africa, it also means no two roads ever connect for the landlocked regions. It's overland transport, which is hugely expensive, especially when there aren't paved roads, and when the basic environment is not enforced security, because this is just rural area with a very low rate of governance because of the utter impoverishment of the area. So I see first isolation. Second, pandemic disease, AIDS, malaria, helminthic infections, other tropical diseases, lack of immunization for children, lack of safe drinking water, indoor air pollution from wood burning, stoves, and that's why 200 out of every 1,000 children born in this village will die before their fifth birthday. This is a rate that is 50 times higher than in the rich world, or at least 20 times higher, depending on exactly where we're talking about. But we have a catastrophic disease crisis. And third, we have a catastrophic food production crisis. This is a village of farmers, as is 3/4 of Africa, and the farmers don't grow enough food to feed themselves, much less to bring food to market. So most farming is subsistence, and most farming indeed is sub-subsistence, meaning that it's not even adequate for subsistence, it's adequate for chronic hunger. These are people that are out of the market. This woman buys no inputs for her farming. She doesn't buy drip irrigation. She does not buy fertilizer. She does not sell anything to the market. And she's no different from the rest of the village. This is an isolated village. And it lives on its own. And it dies on its own. And there's just no interest in the world of Intel to set up a wafer fab factory here. There is no interest in the world for Polo to make its t-shirts here. The markets are not going to save these people. These people are not wanted elsewhere in the world, though they move, and they send illegal remittances. And when their numbers get large enough, they create riots in neighboring countries. like the Burkinabes, they didn't create the riots, they create the object of hate. And response, like the Burkinabe population, the Burkina Faso migrants that came into Cote d'Ivoire and created a touchstone for populist ethnic conflict led by disastrous politicians in Cote d'Ivoire. I'm not blaming the migrants, I'm blaming the local politicians who prey off of them. But these are unwanted people that the markets won't reach and that are not allowed to reach safe shores elsewhere. And they die in very large numbers. I got a lot of slides which I'm not going to show you because actually this is pretty much what you need to see. Why is this a solvable proposition? That's the odd thing. If you think about this practically, and I would argue this anywhere in the world is my own experience, being on the ground and saying, what can you do in this community? You're filled with a large number of very low-cost solutions that immediately stare at you. For example, the number one thing that's wrong with agriculture, food growing in these places, is that the farmers don't use fertilizer. The soils are utterly depleted of nutrients. 100 years ago, this was solved by crop rotation through a large empty area. And so you had slash and burn agriculture, which rotated through large areas. When the nitrogen was depleted, you moved on and slashed the next area. And if you came back in 25 years, natural nitrogen fixation would have replenished the soils, at least to the level of a baseline. Now there's no crop rotation. Population densities are 10 times higher than they were 100 years ago. And nobody moves because there's no excess land. We can agree to chop down the last remaining rainforest and destroy the last remaining natural habitats in Africa, and we're on our path to doing that if we don't do anything about it. But in situ, there is no nutrient replenishment, and the result is that the crop yields are 1 ton per hectare or less, which is about a fifth of what you get from intensive modern farming, and a third of what you get in almost any other part of the developing world. And 1 ton per hectare for a family plot that might be 0.2 hectares does not feed the family. That's why you get chronic undernourishment and 50% wasting rates, and or especially stunting rates of children. There's just not enough food. So what could you do? You could help with fertilizer inputs. Well, the World Bank had this bright idea that it was actually fertilizer subsidies which was the great evil of these countries, and so it cut out all fertilizer subsidies 20 years ago. And the result has been absolutely no fertilizer input at all, and 20 years of hunger that has gone on. And the IMF, which writes these reports, basically the IMF's role in all of this is to care about the inflation rate in this country. Honest to God, that's all they care about, and that's all they know about. And so their interest, which is 98% of their interest, is what's the rate of domestic credit expansion in the economy. And if it's kept low, they write these papers praising the macroeconomic authorities for their soundness. And so I say that the IMF basically writes a death sentence for these people, although the people get to die with price stability. They die nonetheless, but they die with price stability. What the IMF has not recognized is that at an international macroeconomic institution, it might have raised its voice to the alarm, to alarm the world about the mass hunger and the mass pandemic diseases. But it doesn't do that. And one should understand that there has been an assault on the poor in the last 25 years. It took me a long time to understand it, I have to say, because it was something that I came into this field as a macroeconomist with a specialty, and I was pretty good at it, in ending hyperinflations. And for that, you really do need to control domestic credit expansion. It's actually pretty basic. But it's not enough to solve the problems. It's just the first step. And I also don't recommend hyperinflation. But what you can do is say, you know, we've ended the hyperinflation or we've ended the high inflation and now there's mass suffering that we better attend to. Well, in any event, something as simple as fertilizer could actually triple the food production in rural Africa, probably from one season to the next. And we're putting that to the test in a set of villages in Western Kenya right now because a donor came to me last year based on our UN recommendations and said, why don't you try this on a small scale? And we have tried on a small scale the set of interventions we're recommending. And in one growing season in Western Kenya, food production is up 400%. From a village just like this to enabling farmers to buy improved seeds and a fertilizer input. For the first time, they're growing. The harvest is actually in about 3 weeks, so we just see fields that are that on actually the professional agronomists' estimate are 3 times higher in yield and about 50% higher in planting in the village because of the availability of fertilizer and improved seed, and it looks like the total yield will be more than a 4-fold increase in the village, and that's in a 3-month intervention. How do we interpret hunger in Africa? Oh, it's because they're all corrupt. That's what I get on my email messages all the time, from very unhappy people who don't want to contribute $10 per capita per year to this, or whatever it might be. If you look at the disease issue, malaria is actually a controllable disease. It's 100% treatable, which is a pertinent point for a disease which will kill 3 million children this year or thereabouts. When I grew up, I would have thought that 3 million preventable deaths would count for something, especially if it wasn't in a war zone, and especially if it was predictable, so that it wasn't a surprise that came like the tsunami, but was an absolutely predictable clockwork effect. And yet the world has not responded to malaria as controllable as it is. What does it take to control malaria? Basically, 2 things. One, some vector control of the mosquitoes, and the preferred method for Africa is bed nets treated in insecticide. They cost $7, they last 5 years, and the poor can't afford them because the poor have no money. And the second is medicine. And the first-line medicines in Africa for malaria control have failed now because of drug resistance. They've been intensively used for generations. And the next generation of anti-malarials is too expensive for Africa to afford on its own. Chloroquine costs 5 cents a treatment, and it doesn't work anymore. And the one that does work is called artemisinin-based combination drugs, and they cost $1.20 a dose, and they're not affordable in Africa. But it turns out for $3 billion a year, you could do the multiple range of interventions to control malaria. Bed nets, effective medicines, diagnostics, community health workers, local case management, and surely save more than 1 million lives a year. And since there are 1 billion people in the rich world, that would be $3 on average from each. It's not a lot of money in the scheme of things. Instead, we've been spending $100 million a year. So 1/30 of what would be required. And we don't get any malaria control. In fact, U.S. policy is to sell bed nets to poor people through what's called social marketing, which is neither social nor marketing, because it's certainly not social, and nobody can buy it because there are no markets. it's a most failed policy. But in America of today, if you don't sell something to people, they don't value it. And if they can't buy it, we don't value them is the corollary. And so we're allowing mass deaths, and I'm on endless fights with the State Department and the National Security Council because they're a bunch of ignoramuses. I'm using a technical term. They do not know what's going on in these places. They don't visit these places. They don't care enough to visit these places. And there's mass death on their watch. And yet it's completely solvable. And then you can treat people with antiretroviral medicines. They now cost 30 cents per dose per day. The basic combination drug is 3 medicines, and it's now co-formulated in one pill that you take morning and evening. And it's 30 cents per day from an Indian generic producer, Ranbaxy. And there are other generics producers that also produce co-formulated pills at such a remarkably low cost. Yet 2 million Africans will die this year of AIDS because they don't have access to this medicine. Now, of course, on top of the medicine, you need a doctor that can prescribe the drugs and monitor the patient and see the patient once every 30 or 60 or 90 days, and you need nurses trained. But this is actually solvable. We just haven't cared enough to try to solve it. And then on the economic isolation side, it's the same deal. The latest estimates that I've seen by very skilled analysts is that it would cost $1 billion to put the fiber optic cable throughout Africa. $1 billion. Because it's really a low-cost, labor-intensive effort to lay fiber optic cables. You could reach through a combination of fiber optic and local wireless every village in Africa at almost no cost. It's not crazy, actually, to jump to the internet. Email can do wonders for drug supplies, for logistics, for referrals to education, for marketing of produce and many other things. And $1 billion in the scheme of things is not very large. You can also pave roads. In our village, we're helping the village to have a truck. The truck costs $12,000. There are 5,000 people in our villages where we're working in Western Kenya. It's $2.40 per villager. You know, it makes all the difference to be able to bring in fertilizer on a pickup, or to take crops to a market, or to carry a woman dying in labor to a sub-district hospital rather than putting her in a wheelbarrow and pulling a wheelbarrow 5 kilometers and having her dead by the time they arrive at the sub-district hospital. So what we did in the Millennium Project was actually try to cost all of this. And it turns out, broadly speaking, that what is required for investments in basic infrastructure, disease control, water management, soil nutrients, is on the order of about 0.5% per year of the rich world GNP. And since the rich world gives some other aid to middle-income countries, we have to give a lot of aid to Iraq because every time we put something in Iraq, it gets blown up, so you have to factor in the replacement costs. And we're spending twice as much in, quote, aid to Iraq this year as we do for all of Africa. $7 billion of, quote, aid, not to mention the $80 billion for the military, and $3 billion for all of Africa. Turns out that in addition to the 0.5 of 1% you would need for development aid for the poorest of the poor, it'd probably be a good idea to have total aid at the level of 0.7% of gross national product of the rich world. Why 0.7%? Well, that's what the rich world has promised the poor world for 35 years. This has been the international target for aid. And actually, George Bush even signed on to it in 2002 in this document in Monterrey, Mexico, that I mentioned briefly, where it says in paragraph 42 that all the signatories, including President Bush, signed, says we urge developed countries that have not done so to make concrete efforts towards the target of 0.7% of gross national product as official development assistance. Now, the United States total development assistance is 0.16% of GNP, not 0.7. So it's less than a fourth of the promise. It's running at about $18 billion now, compared to the $84 billion that would be 0.7%. Of that $18 billion in the U.S., half of that is for the security countries, including this region, Pakistan, Turkey, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Colombia. The rest of the $9 billion is divided among low-income countries. $3 billion goes to all of Africa. Of what goes to Africa, of the $3 billion, $1 billion is emergency food shipments. It's no aid at all for development. $1 billion is for AIDS, which is okay. And the last $1 billion, which is for everything, is mainly American consultant salaries. There's essentially no aid to Africa. Israel has received more aid over the last 50 years than from the United States than the U.S. gave to all of Africa. Just to give you a perspective, considerably more. And so this is not to begrudge aid to Israel. This is to say we haven't begun to meet a target for the world's poorest people. We have a mythology in the world that, well, Africa is so corrupt that all the money went down the drain. There's no money that went, and there are no drains. There are no drains in Africa. There's no sanitation. There's no place where we're giving money. It's all mythology. This is really important to understand. We have talked ourselves into a war on the poor. I actually got an email a couple days ago from an American who said, aid is terrible. Why throw aid to corrupt regimes? He said, countries like Israel prove you don't need aid. I'm all the admirer, except the aid I don't think we should begrudge. But that's how bizarre the discussion is. Now let me say a word about Israel's aid to the rest of the world. I can't find any. Israel 20 years ago used to give some aid to Africa. I think Israel felt burned politically in several UN votes, which were truly despicable, and aid stopped. And I think this is a great shame, actually, and a huge mistake politically for Israel. Because probably a lot of people here have the same view of Africa, that Africa's Mr. Mugabe, or Africa's Idi Amin, and why should we do anything? And actually Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is 49 countries. Many of them are democracies like Malawi. It's just the people are impoverished and dying, and they actually need help. Israel, by the way, has the kind of help that's probably the most pertinent help. You know how to grow food in difficult agroecological zones. This probably is the #1 challenge. And so getting some good help on drip irrigation, on water management in water-stressed environments, on improved seeds that are drought-tolerant and so forth, on growing season and so forth. This is something that Israel ought to be offering. And it is a big mistake for Israel not to be doing this, in my view, politically. Because actually there are a lot of countries in Africa that would love to have Israel as help and partner, and where the relationship would be enormously mutually fruitful and beneficial. But it stopped a while ago, what had started, and I think it's really, really sad. Closer to home, in Gaza and the West Bank, but especially Gaza where there's extreme poverty, the one direct lesson that I would say is practical problem solving is really the key issue. So doing a close diagnosis of the Palestinian economic situation is extremely important. It's also not true here that corruption is the one word of the textbook that needs to be assessed. Actually, there's a fundamental water crisis in Gaza that really is severe and that's a major cause of massive disease and a major barrier to economic development. And it is important to attend to. Probably the only way it's going to be attended to in the longer term is major desalination works for both Israel and Palestinian areas, and to do that jointly. And I think that fortunately for this region, aid has not been a limiting factor, and aid would come for that as well. But I think thinking in practical terms about the things that can be done to alleviate the extreme poverty in your own neighborhood would be a very important thing for this country to do. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We'll take some questions.
If they're allowed to speak at an economic session. Could you elaborate on the role of the World Bank that could be different than the one he's doing right now?
A couple of days ago, on June 27th, we had an article in the Herald Tribune, and right after the article, David Brooks had an article in which he really threw hell at you for spending a lot of money, throwing trillions of dollars in Africa, and the last sentence he says, if a la Sachs, we assume money translates easily into growth, if we pour aid into Africa without regard to local institutions, we will do little good. We will exhaust donors, and we will discredit the aid enterprise for years to come. Now, he's not here, so you can give him hell.
In ancient days, the Catholic Church established a policy of helping the indigent poor by saying, if you don't help them, we're not going to give you a ticket to the kingdom of heaven. Today, if you were going to say, okay, I'll give you a ticket to a liberal utopia headed by Queen Hillary and King Bill, I don't think you'll find too many takers. So why not get down to the real problem, which is right in the picture behind you, unwanted children. Children whose parents cannot take care of them. If every parent, every individual who raised a child had to guarantee the sustenance of that child, this problem would disappear.
I've been involved in what you were talking about, the Israeli aid project to Africa and other countries too, underdeveloped countries all over the world. And one of the things that I would say about this, the Israeli effort, was the involvement of Israeli people, not always experts, but and not always agronomists, but what we call BKs, which is from kibbutz, people who moshavniks and so on, in the project in the field. And this made the main difference. And then sometime, this was when I was working in Iran, there were the Peace Corps, although they were not educated as such, but still, being in the field, working with the people, made a lot of difference. It didn't work so much in Iran, but because of other problems. So you didn't put any, you didn't mention this personal involvement in these projects.
My name's Roy. I'm a first-year PPE student at the Hebrew University. I just wanted to ask, conventional wisdom says that growth is the object of macroeconomic policy. As you've stated, growth maybe doesn't help some of the most impoverished regions of the planet. And if growth may not be so good for the developed countries, and one of the biggest arguments for growth maybe is that it helps raise the poor a bit higher than they are right now, and it doesn't do that, maybe growth is not what we should be aiming at. Maybe a better way of distributing the wealth we have. If you could.
Let me start with David Brooks. David Brooks doesn't know anything about this subject, which is par for the course of the conservative attack on the poor. And so this man has zero experience and zero knowledge of the numbers, but he repeats this great myth about how much money has been poured down the drain. Now, as I said, aid to Africa has been less than aid to Israel, just to put it in a framework. But actually, aid to all of Africa has totaled, from 1960 onward, has totaled about $45 billion from the United States. So we spend more in 1 year in the Iraq War, by far, than we've spent on all aid to Africa from 1960 till now. It's a complete shame and lie about this money down the drain. This is an ignored problem, not a failed policy. Almost everything of the little we've spent has been either American food aid or consultant salaries. So we've given almost nothing to actually make an investment in these problems. It's all a lie. Once in a while, we actually throw money at a problem, like trying to eradicate smallpox, and succeeded. And that eradication, by the way, that included eradication in Central African Republic and Niger and Rwanda and Zimbabwe and the whole world. So actually, that's a tough case that used to take that caused hundreds of millions of deaths in history and caused millions and millions of infections and was 100% eradicated. Even in the war zones, the wars stopped for immunization days. And Rotary International right now, on its own voluntary effort, is on the verge of eradicating polio the same way. And Jimmy Carter individually has led an effort on African guinea worm, which is this close to eradicating African guinea worm for a pittance. The same thing with leprosy. The same thing with trachoma. The same thing with UNICEF's campaign to raise immunizations. Actually, once in a while, we try something and it succeeds. The big myth is, it's like the war on poverty. It was declared in the United States in 1965, and it was deemed a failure in 1969. And that was, of course, a very different thing, but it shows how the ideology runs way ahead of the evidence. And Mr. Brooks is absolutely unqualified to say a word on this. But what he does reflect is the spirit of the discussion. What should the World Bank do and the IMF, different from what they do right now? Right now, the way the system works is that this is what I do for a living. You're in a poor country. You see the list of problems. They're supposed to be addressed through investment in bed nets or investment in roads or soil nutrients or whatever, but of course there's no money. The promise is that there actually could be money to address these needs, but instead of mobilizing the resources, what happens is the IMF and the World Bank call around to the, quote, donors and ask, so how much is available for such and such country? And it's a small amount. And they tell the country that's what you have. Now the role of the IMF is to make them happy to live within their means. So you're given this much, and okay, do the best you can with it. And don't say a word and don't complain, because if you do, we'll cut you off at the knees. And what does it mean, actually? It literally means if a finance minister stands up and complains, he's gone. That's true repeatedly throughout my own career of watching this. You can't speak out against Washington. You can't tell the truth. You just have to take it. I'm not allowed to tell the truth. I can tell the truth. I have tenure. Thank goodness, because by the way, when I started this enterprise and I spoke out about the need to cancel debts of poor countries, which took them 20 years to get to the announcement last month, one of my senior colleagues came up and said to me that someone on the board of trustees of Harvard didn't like it. This was a senior official from one of the commercial banks. If I hadn't had tenure, it would have been the end either of my career or my speaking out. It's not easy, actually. It's not easy to run against City Hall. And when City Hall is Washington and when it's on a path, it ain't easy. And it ain't easy to get the media to reach, to have a real discussion, and especially when we're talking, quite frankly, about people with black skins that have no money, no interest in markets, that are sick, that are dying, and have no reach in the world. It's also not easy. So this, I believe, what the World Bank and the IMF ought to be doing, to come back to the point, is they ought to be speaking out to the world to say to the United States, you are leaving people to die, and we can't be party to that silently. These people need help. But the whole system is designed not to hear their help, because the mission is driven by the board, which is governed by the rich countries. And the political economy of the IMF and the World Bank is not that they're international institutions with 184 members, which they have, but they are creditor-driven institutions. They're precisely to keep the barbarians at the gates away from American taxpayers. And if you want to know the power structure, what's called the Washington Consensus includes all of 4 blocks in the world. 15th in Pennsylvania all the way to 19th in Pennsylvania. 15th in Pennsylvania is the Treasury Building. 16th in Pennsylvania is the White House. 17th in Pennsylvania is the executive office buildings and the restaurants where 15th, 16th, 18th, and 19th Street people eat. 18th in Pennsylvania is the World Bank, and 19th in Pennsylvania is the International Monetary Fund. That's how it works. It's to keep these people away from America's taxpayers. But soon, we're not even going to have taxpayers in America, because we don't need taxes anymore. It's wonderful. If we can just get the budget deficit up from 6% of GNP to 20%, we're done. No more taxpayers to worry about. And we're trying to make all the tax cuts permanent also. So we don't need government, either for ourselves or for anybody else. That's the road we're on. It's preposterous. But the general assault on all social spending is both inside the United States and abroad. You want people to have less children, help them get contraception and family planning. Why are we cutting the budgets and cutting UNFPA off at the knees? Why don't we talk about family planning? Because our fundamentalist government in the United States and Saudi Arabia and the Vatican have decided this is not fit discussion for the public at large. Because we have an administration, not King Bill and Queen Hillary, but King George, the worst, who is absolutely taking family planning and contraception off the agenda, even when condoms could actually stop AIDS transmission, because they want Africa to have no sex. Truly. Now, the fact of the matter is that family planning works, contraception works, and the demographic transition works. And to make a demographic transition takes about 10 years only these days. You could reduce fertility rates from 6 to under 3 in 10 years in Africa. What would it take? Widespread availability of contraception, family planning, advice, girls' education, and saving children. Because when children die in large numbers, families do not limit the number of children. It's only when the children are surviving that fertility rates come down. So just complaining about a real problem is not a solution. And you're right that the population in Africa is exploding. But to control it requires an analysis. What would you do? Because, by the way, all those deaths I'm talking about is not stopping this population growth, it's exacerbating it. It's the reason why fertility remains at 6. And denying contraception isn't going to do anything. And having a fundamentalist NGO go to preach abstinence isn't going to do anything. And complaining about the number of children they're having isn't going to do anything. But actually helping to make the demographic transition from 6 to 3 within 10 years could solve this problem. That's a policy that you need. I agree with you. But it doesn't come on its own. And it's a matter of child survival as much as anything else. And this is shown all over the world repeatedly. In terms of grassroots aid, I believe in it for the reasons you stressed. It engages our whole society. The Peace Corps has done more for America's knowledge of the world than for helping the world, but that's okay. I mean, helping the world directly, that's valuable. And so we need expertise, we need people-to-people exchange, we need Rotary International, we need NGOs, but we do need Israel to be re-engaged in this as well. Because all I find once in a while is an Israeli agronomist who's kind of left over from 20 years ago, who says, yeah, I'm still working, I have an office in Nairobi, but everyone else has left. And this is really, I think, if the Israeli government looked at the situation, I know that everyone is 100% captivated internally, but we can't afford to be. We have to look more broadly. And if Israel looked at the situation in Africa right now, I could name 15 places that would be delighted to have Israel as a partner and helper, and it could only be good diplomatically. And so I think this is really something I recommend it strongly. This is not just rhetoric I'm talking about. Real action needed after years of neglect. Then finally on the question of growth and poverty. I think there are two big things to say here. One is three big things to say. First, without solving problems of the poor, often you can't get growth, period. So to say growth will solve poverty sometimes gets it backwards, because if you have pandemic disease, you won't even get growth. So first is part of a growth agenda is a poverty agenda of attacking some of the underlying reasons for lack of growth, such as pandemic disease or agricultural pervasive failure. If you want to get growth in Africa, put soil nutrients in, you'll triple crop yields, and GNP will be the fastest growth in history, because growth will be in the agricultural sector. So first, sometimes attacking poverty is directly promoting growth. The corollary is that general growth, raising incomes, does tend to raise the poor up, but not necessarily. If you have geographic or ecological or disease-related reasons why the poor are stuck where they are, or if the poor are living in conditions of ethnic or religious or geographic discrimination, which is often, or gender discrimination, which is often the case. So growth may be insufficient. But third, you raise a deeper question, is growth for what anyway? Because the one thing that's absolutely true, and it's a massive failure of the economics profession, is that the indicator that we use to measure economic improvement is this GNP, gross national product. It is a horrendously bad measure of human well-being. And this is a measure that goes back 80 years now. It was designed brilliantly in 1920 by Simon Kuznets. But it's actually 85 years old, more or less, and it doesn't pick up ecological issues, environmental issues. It can't distinguish the wonders of spending a lot more money to stand in traffic jams for 3 hours. It can't distinguish the, increased great spending on litigation, all due respect to the lawyers, because it's not a measure of human well-being. And it doesn't track human well-being above the bottom. It doesn't track human well-being very well at all. You can have, as the United States has, 30 years of economic growth and no improvement in the self-report of levels of happiness in the society. And that should mean something. It should force us to think more deeply about what we're measuring. And we know lots of reasons why this is bad measure. So I am in favor of improving material well-being. But in our day and age, that's not GNP. That is modified indicators that take into account the environment, that take into account non-monetary material aspects of our life, like leisure time, public goods, access to nature, safety of the physical environment, all sorts of things which are not measured in GNP. And so I believe in growth of the right thing. And that is, and the right thing would be a deeper measure of material well-being that also took into account its sustainability. And broad measures of growth have almost nothing to do with that. So, and it also, broad measures of growth that we use right now don't take into account what issue we were talking about before the session, the widening income inequality. And the fact that in the United States, almost all the growth in the economy has gone to the very top of the income distribution during the last 25 years. And not just to the top, but to the very top, which has reaped an incredible proportion of what passes for economic growth. So these are all really pertinent issues that the economics profession has fallen down on very badly.
Alan Herman from Jerusalem. Good evening. I'm asking about an urgent matter, and that is why doesn't the UN take up the matter of a global food bank in a practical way? I was a Peace Corps volunteer, since that was brought up a few moments ago, 30 years ago in Afghanistan. And in the early years of the 70s, there was a famine. It's a landlocked nation. And people were so poor that they grazed. They crawled on the ground to eat the grass. And we spent a good deal of time burying people. But what the United States did, I believe in conjunction with some other nations, is fly in food. The food had to be distributed by horseback, and we were taught how to ride horses so that we could lead convoys of horses bringing in food. One volunteer to a province. My point is not to say what I did, but there was a food bank, and the food immediately relieved the crisis, the urgent crisis of hunger, and then slowly an infrastructure could be developed, simple roads, and digging for the water table to bring up water from the ground and so forth. Why not a global food bank to just immediately distribute food?
In terms of what to do about economics, I use the analogy of clinical medicine, and I am trying myself to follow that logic in redesigning teaching programs as well. Turns out that before 1920, when doctors were trained, they also didn't have formal clinical training. They were trained in scientific programs, but without clinical hospitals. And there was a major revolution that introduced clinical training into medical school training in the 1920s, following recommendations of William Osler and others that the Rockefeller Foundation promoted. And I'm trying to instill at Columbia University a new concept of clinical economics training. I have vowed that I will. It actually struck me one day, it was kind of an epiphany when a student told me he was writing a dissertation, I think it was about Nigeria, because his advisor had given him a Nigerian data set, and of course he'd never been and never planned to go to Nigeria as he was writing this, but he was going to do the work in the data set, and I have vowed myself throughout my career never to advise a student on a country where they're not actually visiting and working in the field. But I believe, as a more general matter, we need clinical training to actually be involved in the practical work that we're engaged in. And the idea, which I've been told for 25 years, well, it's nice, Jeff, you have your academic work, but aren't you spending a little too much time on this advising stuff? which is what my colleagues have tended to say. I find it preposterous because I wouldn't understand anything if I weren't doing the practical things. And so the idea that there's this bifurcation, that one's a nice hobby and one's your real work, is, to me, is such a deep misunderstanding about the nature of this field that it really requires, in my mind, a rethink of how we teach. So I want students in my field in development to be working in practical development issues, to be writing dissertations about places that they're actually working in and seeing and thinking and being exposed to the real problems, because I don't think that we can get anywhere without that. Good that you mentioned Afghanistan. That's an example of a desperately poor place, which thank God can't bother us. If you look at a map, it's just in the middle of Central Asia, so nothing too terrible can come out of Afghanistan. And so we can leave it alone. There was one thing. Al-Qaeda. It's an example for me, by the way, of why it is wrong to believe that any part of the world is just garbage. And in my country, I got a very, was absolutely, I refer a lot to my emails because this is my way to have a kind of dialogue with Americans right now, and I get hundreds of them. And somebody wrote to me yesterday saying, Professor Sachs, this is not to be mean, I'm not being a jerk, and I'm not writing to give you a hard time, but why should I care about Africa? And I wrote back a kind of long response to this person. But actually, it is a cultural sickness that is a widespread view. It's also an analytical mistake, but I would start out just with the ethics. It's shocking to me that this can be even mentioned on an ethical basis. Why should we care? And we, of all people, should know that. That's the question that was asked about us. And it's, to me, the most amazing thing in the world that this question can be asked still in the 21st century. But it was asked in an absolutely straightforward way, and the fact is most people don't care about anything outside of or don't care about much outside, but with cultivation of the mind and experience and teaching, people do care more broadly and should, and that's the route to safety in the world. So I think that this is just one point I wanted to make about Afghanistan. There is not a World Food Bank, there is a World Food Program, which every crisis that comes, it's called WFP, the World Food Program, they're in charge of famine relief. And they do a wonderful job, but every famine that comes, they have to go around cap in hand begging for help. And the famine relief, we have famine fatigue. We're fatigued by this famine. So many famines. Why do you keep bothering us about all of this, we ask. And so we don't actually get around to it. And the answer is the politicians. One thing to understand about the UN, it is designed to be powerless. Please understand that. The last thing in the world that the United States wants is a powerful UN. This is a huge mistake, in my opinion. But one should understand, I'm constantly asked, why does Kofi Annan do this? Why do you're working for this terrible organization, I'm told. All the time. By a lot of Jews in the United States also. Why do you work for this organization? And why doesn't it do this? And why doesn't it do that? And congressmen excoriating me. Why does Kofi Annan let Darfur go on? And I say, well, do you know the Security Council is actually under the U.S. auspices? Oh, yeah, that's true, but why does Kofi Annan do this? The powerful countries don't want the United Nations. They don't like the United Nations. The fact that 100 or so impoverished countries depend for their survival on the effectiveness of UN institutions is not recognized or known. And we're on the biggest anti-UN campaign in U.S. history right now. And it's absolutely phony, media-driven, driven by powerful U.S. interests in the White House and elsewhere that's trying to destroy this institution. And it's wrong. So if we could have a food bank, and I've talked about lines of credit and so forth for having the food that's needed, but they don't want it. It's not that I haven't thought about it also like you, but the powerful countries don't want that kind of independent, automatic accessibility to resources. They want a weak United Nations that can do their bidding, not an effective United Nations that can actually operate institutionally on its own. And whenever a UN agency says something that is against U.S. policy, they're threatened with cuts of the budget, directly, crudely. You might not believe how crude it is, but it's amazing to me. You issue a report that says some words about some part of policy that the U.S. administration is involved in, pow. Next day phone calls. If I give a speech, this one, next day phone calls. This is why there is no effective institution, because the powerful countries don't want one. It's a mistake, because U.S. is not gaining security by all this approach. This is not a route to security. It's an illusion. Finally, in terms of where Israel could be most effective, and the question of Muslim and Christian areas and where things could be done, there is no sharp divide in this regard in Africa. Some of the most effective governments are Muslim, others Christian, some of the most terrible ones in each, and most of the places I'm working mixed. In Ghana or in Mali or in East Africa and Kenya or in Ethiopia or elsewhere, by nature these are mixed, religiously and ethnically mixed regions. Corruption and war matter. Some places are just thuggishly corrupt, and I have no solution for them. I do not believe in regime change the way we've tried it. I think it's a disastrous mistake. So I don't believe in sending in the American Air Force to change a regime. So with Mugabe, I believe we're going to have to wait him out. But fortunately, there are still laws of nature that these guys don't go on forever. I'm looking for his political demise, let me be clear. In terms of, I think that people that have been in power more than 20 years, it's time for a change. And he's holding on to power quite viciously, and I don't believe in those places what I'm talking about really can be done. But there are a lot of places not like that. A lot of the wars in Africa are wars of poverty. This should be understood. It's not that these are terrible places and therefore you can't help them. The wars themselves, because of war, but the wars themselves are a reflection of poverty. The Darfur crisis in Sudan, first and foremost, is an ecological crisis. Insufficient rainfall, rising population, a scarcity of food and water, and people killing each other on the ground level. This is first and foremost what Darfur is about. And there are now lots of interesting papers, including one that my colleagues have just written, showing that when the rains fail in Africa, the wars break out. That's a level of desperation that's almost unimaginable for us these days. A drought-induced war. But that's actually pretty common in Africa. That suggests that the right approach is not peacekeepers, but drip irrigation. That's the right way to stop wars in Africa, is drip irrigation. Thanks very much.
I'd like to thank you, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, in the names of all of you, for not least taking us from our small things, disengagement, etc., to world affairs, earth affairs. And I wish you safe journey to Yemen and beyond, and to all of you when you go home through the Orange or whatever. So good night.